Welcome back to the Omniverse Comics Guide podcast for another collector's item special. I'm Dave, and in these episodes we invite a guest to delve into their comic collection and share some of their favourite items. Let me try and express just how excited I am to introduce today's guest. He worked with Alan Moore on Top 10 and wrote the Eisner Award-winning Top 10 sequel series. He was nominated for an Eisner for his graphic novel Heck. He wrote the Transformers Bumblebee miniseries as part of the beloved IDW era of the Transformers comics, and this is the clincher. He's the creator of my favourite series of all time, which took the coveted #1 spot on my own personal best collected editions of 2023 list, Kaijumax. Joining us in the Omniverse today, it's Zander Cannon. How you doing, Zander?
Thanks for having me. Good. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I mean, not only do you top the list last year, and I actually held off on doing those episodes because I wanted to make sure we got this book in the list because I knew it was going to trump it.
Yeah, you said that in the thing, and so I was listening to that podcast because I was tagged in it or something. I think you tagged me on something, and so I was like, all right, well, here we go. Maybe I'll be on, maybe I'll be number 5 or 9 or whatever it was, and I'm listening, and I'm like, it's getting kind of towards the end of this podcast. They haven't talked about it yet. I'm like, wait a second.
They lied.
I know what that means. So anyway, that made my day, week, year, whatever. I mean, it was so awesome. Oh. It just was fun. It's, that's the whole reason that you do it, right? That you find like your sort of like kindred spirits where it's like, this comic isn't for everyone, but the people who it's for, it's really for them.
Well,
they're like, every once in a while people will be like, oh yeah, it just combines the two things that I love the most. And I'm like, you're sick in a way.
Prison and
really
kaiju. The two things. Right. Well, that's the weird thing because I love a combo. That's what I love about this book. It's such an unexpected combination of two things I don't often actually watch either of. But that's why it works to me in a way because it's almost like a double negative.
Right. Well, and I think that that kind of stuff can be a little hacky.
Yeah.
Like, hey, this plus the Dracula plus sharks or what, like that kind of stuff. It's been done.
Not a fan of Sharknado then?
One, maybe. I don't know. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, so it's fun. It's fun to sort of take a stupid concept and then kind of run with the ball, and sort of say, all right, let's take this with deadly seriousness. Kind of. I mean, with the silly stuff all mixed in, I don't know.
That was one of my favourite moments of this, and again, I mentioned it in the episode, was the Pokemon moment. And again, I'm not massively into Pokemon, but I'm surrounded by it. So my kids are into it. My wife is into it. One of my friends is really into it. And then this starts happening. I'm in stitches, and this starts this volume. And it was just such a great beginning for me to get me back into it, because I wanted to do a full read through, because I'm trying to wave all 3, but they're so heavy.
Oh God, yeah. So yeah, you got to plant your feet, lift with your legs.
I had to watch a safety video before I did that.
Oh sure. Yeah, it's I was too old for Pokemon when it came out, or when it came to the States anyway, and so yeah, my son was really into it for a while. I mean, he's outgrown it or whatever, but I learned how to play the card game, and I watched the shows, and I jumped in with both feet because I'm like. I'm predisposed for that kind of stuff, right? We're all comic book nerds who like dumb stuff, so.
What do you mean?
Yeah, right. And so, so it's like, but it was nice to sort of like, again, it's like this book is sort of like a clearinghouse for all this dumb stuff that I absorb from, comic books, prison dramas, monster movies, Pokemons, whatever.
That's the thing that gets me the most, and I don't think I've had this experience since The Invisibles, because when I read The Invisibles by Grant Morrison, have you read The Invisibles?
Mm-hmm, yeah, probably not every page, but some of it, yeah.
Yeah, it can be quite a challenge to get through, and in the end, I basically bought a guidebook, and the guidebook does a page, it's basically a panel by panel breakdown of what everything means and all the references, and Grant Morrison's involved in that process. That there is quite a degree of that in Kaijumax, and in these. Are they in the trades? Do you do the same notes in the trades, or is it just?
No, that's just for the hardcovers.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, so I mean, and that was a little. It was a little bit of a it was a little bit, not a fight, but it was a little bit like I kind of had to really pitch the idea of these footnotes, so that because they're intrusive a little bit, and like I don't know, I think that I still think it took me a little while to do them.
I bet.
So, yeah.
So
but the nice thing is, like, not every book needs like footnotes on every page. This one does. And so it's nice. I mean, just in the way that it's nice that you can that there is something to say about every page. Like, oh yeah, that's a reference to such and such. And, but yeah, like, but yeah, I always thought it was like, it was a way that I could add value to it without doing any more drawing.
Lazy option, eh? Is that what?
It's funny because it's like, I like drawing. I mean, obviously I do it a lot, but like, anytime I had to do like an extra drawing for the thing, I'm like, oh, must I? But I'll write, 50 pages. And then doing comics is the opposite, where it's just like, oh, writing, oh, the worst. But I love drawing it. So
are you completely? Are you kind of at a point where you're happy to move away from Kaijumax now? Are you kind of sick of talking about it to a degree? I suppose like where the trade or the season 6 series finished in 2022, it must seem like there's been a bit of a gap between even really having to think about it.
Yeah, well, and I mean, and I've done interviews about it, and I talk about it, and I don't ever get sick of talking about it because it's great fun, and I mean, I always love to hear that somebody got something out of it, or really, really enjoyed it, or felt like it really sort of was like all of their, interests all put together.
Yeah.
But it is because all of a sudden it was like I felt that the sort of the flywheel in my head that's like spinning and like gathering kaiju trivia could finally like wind down. And then go like, people are like, you going to go see Godzilla -1? And I'll be like, yeah, eventually. But I don't have to see it this today.
I don't want to see it now, or else have to do a season 7. Can you see it now?
Sure.
I want a season 7.
Yeah. I mean, people, when I said that Kaijumax was ending or it was announced or whatever, people were like, oh, I wish it could go forever. And it's like, not me. Like, I'm so, and that was what it felt like. It felt like there was this sort of wheel in my head, this gyroscope or whatever, that's just constantly spinning and constantly having to sort of like keep track of 50, storylines and characters and like, how can this match into this sort of kaiju thing that's happening, or like, oh, there's a new, Godzilla -1 is coming out. We got to sort of like bring that in somehow, and that's exhausting.
That guy's tiring. Yeah,
it's tiring. And thinking in color too, like that was, I mean, so much about that book was the color, and so I was always thinking about the color, and I was always looking at the sky and going like, how would I do that in Photoshop?
Oh wow.
Because every the comic's all outside, so every page has a has a sky that I have to like, I'm trying to make them nice, and so
we did
all
a
that
fine
sort
job.
of stuff was thank you. It was nice to have that stuff kind of.
Yeah, I bet. Well, one of the things I think that I really like about this, and we'll get into your favorite items, your collection in just a moment, actually. One of the things I really like about reading a book like Kaijumax is that it has a beginning, middle, and end, and that's really pleasing for me. Having been a fan of mainstream comics since I was like 8 years old, and it's ongoing. It's never ending. There is no end to the story. There's never intended to be an end to the story. And now reading stuff like this, where you do get an ending, it's really satisfying. Like I like that feeling. And when you make that jump, because if you don't tend to read stuff like that and you make that jump, it's like you didn't realize how satisfying that was.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
And I think that's, man, when I talk about writing in comics, I always have to say, like, reading, American comic books are terrible training for like story structure, because even, like the best ones, and I mean, this is showing my age, our age, whatever, like, growing up reading comics in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it's like, it was like every month is just sort of this jolt of like story and character and stuff, but nothing was ever sort of being wrapped up. Or if it was, there was always like a little coda at the end to say like, well, Morbius, the living vampire, is still alive out there somewhere, whatever. Like, and so like, yeah, I remember, I mean, I always feel like I'm butting heads with editors whenever I try to sort of do mainstream comics, where I kind of want to have these sort of like discrete chunks of story, and that's not what they want. And I'm not saying it's less good, and I'm not saying like, oh, I'm too good. It's like, it's a different beast, because you're meant to be a steward of these characters, where you just sort of say like, yes, I'm coming in, and now whatever, the X-Men are doing such and such for this 14 months, and then I can easily pass them along to other people. And of course, there could be like deaths and marriages and whatever, but it's never sort of like, oh, we tied it up with a bow. It's a Swiss watch of the story.
That's the end of the story now.
Yeah,
Bye,
that's
X-Men.
just, I mean, but when you're doing something that's creator-owned and small press and finite, you want it to really feel finite and go, I mean, even though like Kaijumax is meant to sort of feel like, yes, the prison still exists and everything is continuing on as it was, but this is the story that I told, and I don't want to sort of dilute it or make it not worth, tying it up as in a bow at the end.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. So now, at the risk of actually seeing one of these mainstream I don't know what you're going to show me, but we're going to jump into your first one. So you've chosen your 5 categories, and the one I want you to show me first is your favorite cover.
Okay, so this is a bad start because it's not a comic. This is a magazine, but it's full of comics.
It's favorite cover. It's a cover.
And so I was I found these in my basement, and so I brought them at the studio, and this one's been staring at me for like a couple months. It's the Mad Magazine cover for Return of the Jedi. Well, Return of the Jedi and the A-Team are both in it, and so
oh wow!
So it's Darth Vader taking off his mask, and it's Mr. T, and it's painted on a board, it's like, Alfred E. Newman is an Ewok. Like, it's such a dumb,
bizarre.
It's so stupid. Like, so much technique and so much skill being put into something that's so stupid. Like, that I can really get into that, right? Like, that's. But I mean, it's like, like pitch perfect, like caricatures. I mean, almost like, portraits of all these. It's really quite stupid. And I mean, again, it's like, this is a Mad magazine that I probably read 500 times 40 years ago. I guess the question is, do they have to make him drink milk to get him on a Star Destroyer? That's right.
Is that how?
Right. Poison him or whatever they had to do on the A-Team. Yeah.
That's such a random choice. I've never actually read Mad magazine. Ever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have very fond memories of it, but then I'll go back and read it, and I'm like, "Whew, this is problematic stuff."
Oh, really?
Like, well, it's like, but I mean, it also was great, funny, funny stuff, great cartooning. I mean, so much of my sort of aesthetic was created by that, especially Sergio Aragones.
Oh God.
Because he was doing all the marginals, like they called Mad Marginals. So they're like in like the margins of the pages, he would have these little wordless gags.
Really?
That were, top notch. It's a problematic fate for me.
Yeah.
Magazines.
What isn't, though, at this point? It's
very
difficult to find something from back then, and that can be like the 90s even, or early 2000s, where some stuff is still...
Totally.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, or stuff that seemed very progressive now. It's like, people are like, no, you cannot make fun of racism in this particular way. And it's like, oh, all right, well, and it's like, well, yeah, that's a good point. Uh-huh. But now that is a whole section of humor that's like sort of, exiled.
Yeah.
That's communicated from the comedy hierarchy.
Forever. Yeah. So, could you share with us your guilty pleasure?
Okay, my guilty pleasure.
Yeah.
So, the Ultimates.
Uh-huh.
Which, it's like, Mark Miller has become a little bit of a lightning rod, sort of. He's sort of playing footsie with some Comicsgate people or whatever. But Brian Hitch is one of the best comic book artists ever. You know, like, I mean, this was one of those things that hit me like. I mean, this is 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's so right wing. It's the framing of it is so appalling, but it was also sort of like this moment in time where you're like, yeah, like. The Avengers, who are kind of like old and boring at the time. I mean, Iron Man hadn't come out. The event, all those Avengers were like third stringers.
Yeah.
In terms of popularity.
Yeah, totally.
This is the era of X-Men, and this is the era of Spider-Man movies, and like they all of a sudden, it was almost like making Avengers Endgame. At the time it was like, wow, it's big, it's bold, it's globe-trotting. Everybody looked great. All the costumes were redesigned. It was just,
Although
anyway.
even when they don't, it's one of the parts that I really, really liked was when they're basically sat around, they've got nothing to do because they've formed this team and they've got no one to fight. So they're just chatting about who would play them in the film, which in a weird way has that extra irony to it in that Samuel L. Jackson suggests Nick Fury suggests Samuel L. Jackson play him, which was before Samuel L. Jackson was cast.
Right, but I thought it was so funny that I was like, oh man, that's such a missed opportunity. Like, he was so very obviously Samuel L. Jackson that I just wish that he had said, I want like Don Cheadle to play me, or something, just somebody else.
That's a fair point.
And I'd be like,
that's a fair point.
Just because, I mean, it's one thing if like Brian Hitch hadn't made it look exactly like him, a photograph of him. So it's super right-wing nonsense, but I love. But it's so sort of powerfully and sort of propulsive reading. I just love it.
Did you stick through through Ultimates 2 as well? Is that included in that?
If Brian Hitch drew it, then I did. Yeah. I'm so disloyal when it comes to comic book series. It's like Excalibur. If Alan Davis isn't drawing it, I don't care.
I think that's fair. That's the law.
One bit. People are like, do you like Excalibur? I'm like, yes, it's one of the greatest comics ever. And they're like, or do you just like Alan Davis? I'm like, I just like Alan Davis. I'll fully admit it.
I'll literally buy anything Alan Davis does because his stuff is just so smooth.
Oh, yeah.
It's beautiful. I met him I'm so lucky. Well, I've met him twice. The first time I met him, I humiliated myself completely because I hadn't met any comic creators before. And I was so overwhelmed. I was going down Artist Alley at a Comic-Con, the first one I ever went to, and it was like 10 plus years ago.
Wow.
And I was just leaning over him trying to breathe. And then I was thinking, like, say something. Think of something you can think of a question. You must have tons of questions. And then I just was about to ask one, and my wife went, do you find it weird when nerds just lean over you breathing heavy?
Wow.
And then my
bus.
heart broke. And then he looked up and he went, I didn't even know he was there. And I just like, oh, twisting that knife, Alan.
Yeah. I met him years ago. I mean, I was probably 23 or 4. I mean, really young, really early in my career, and I felt like he's really supportive and really kind, and and then I just saw him last summer, which was at Heroes Con in Charlotte. Oh. I couldn't believe, and he was like, that was the funny thing about Heroes Con is that like there's no like actors or wrestlers or anything like that. It's all he was like the main draw. Him and Chris Claremont were there, and it was like,
wow,
yeah, it was, and how cool is that he was like,
that's amazing.
The star, yeah.
That's how it should be. So, to me, it's how it should be. But I'm yet to find a Comic-Con here that does that. I mean,
it's so hard to make it,
Yeah, it is. I can understand them not doing it, but yeah. I think the first time I went down that Artist Alley, no one was talking to creators at all.
Yeah.
And I wanted to shout at everyone, look, do you know who these people are? That's Mike Plug. That's Mike Plug!
Right.
What's wrong with you?
Yeah. And I mean, but then also you could be like, I just got a chance to shoot the breeze with Mike Plug for, I mean, and it's really fun too, especially if you're like, like, hey, I got this copy of Thor when I was 12 years old, and I thought it was the coolest thing I ever did, and it's, and it's falling apart in your hands. I mean, I love that. If someone shows me a comic that they bought 25 years ago when they were a kid that they've read to pieces, it's like, that makes my day. Like, that's the best thing you've ever seen. That's the whole reason you do it.
It is. That's really sweet. Okay. Are you ready, Zander, to share with us your number 3, which I have selected as a current read?
Oh, I don't have it with me because I was reading it digitally. But Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees.
Oh.
Only 2 issues are out, by Patrick Horvath. If a serial killer lived in Busytown, like Richard Scarry's Busytown, so like a town full of like cute little animals, and the main character is this serial killer who is this nice person that everybody likes, who sensibly goes to other towns to murder people, and then
that's the right move.
Comes back, but then somebody in her town murders someone very publicly, And so she needs to figure out who it is so that people don't start suspecting her.
Wow.
You know, and I was like, this is messed up, and it's drawn in the cute style, you know. And so obviously you know how I like that.
Oh yeah.
Disturbing crap in a cute style. So anyway, it's great. It's very alarming. You know, it's published by IDW. One of the covers is a pig character looking into the window of a butcher shop, and so you see her face reflected in the thing, like over these dead heads of pigs and stuff like that in the butcher shop, which is kind of, you know, not part of the plot at all, but it's very well composed and really sort of alarming. So
wow. I do love that mix, though. That mix of, I mean, it's exactly the mix you have in Kaijumax, where it almost feels like, as for a while, especially with like the language it's used, and it plays into the cuteness of it a little bit, and then it throws you, and it almost it doesn't even have to be that much. Like in some ways, I think if they were humans, and it was constant, you kind of go, okay, he got stabbed several times, right? You know, whereas when something happens when it's very cute, you kind of go, oh my god.
Right.
That's horrifying.
Right. Well, and I mean, and I've had this version of this conversation a couple times where it's like you're abstracting everything. When you're drawing in a cartoony style, you're abstracting everything a little bit, and so people can sort of engage with the idea of it without sort of having to be confronted with the full gruesomeness of it. You know, it's like, it's kind of like, I think in Kaijumax, if there had been a more realistic art style, I think that people would have been really put off by the stuff that was happening, you know, because it's so gruesome and so grim. But when it's absurd on the face of it, that you're like, you can kind of go like, all right, that's messed up morally. Like, but I'm not, you know, I'm not so, like, I don't have to put it away, but I can go like, wow, I can really grapple with this from a sort of an ethical point of view because, you know, it's silly looking. And so I can kind of, you know, I'm not repulsed by it immediately.
I do have a question, actually. The term cartoonist comes up regularly for people like yourself who write and draw. And it's not really a term that I've been that familiar with until more recently. I remember hearing an interview with Alex Ross, and he was referred to as a cartoonist, and he went, what? And it was like, how dare you? I don't cartoon.
Oh, really?
You know? It sounded, he may not have, it may not have been that. It may just been like, but that was the first time he heard it. And like, I can't put cartoonist and Alex Ross in the same thing.
Yeah, I don't know that I would, that would be the first thing that came up. But I also think, well, it's not wrong exactly, because, you know, it's like he writes and draws, and it's like he's telling a story with the pictures. Mm-hmm. I mean, and it is simplified to a degree, I mean, much less than other people. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I remember first being surprised by hearing someone refer to himself as a cartoonist was Frank Miller, and he was also calling Steve Ditko a cartoonist. And Steve Ditko makes a little bit more sense because Steve Ditko's stuff is kooky, you know, a little bit.
Yeah, you could say that.
But Frank Miller, I mean, depending on what era you look at, can be very grim and very gritty and very sort of like self-serious. But I really liked that he said, oh yeah, I'm a cartoonist, because he really, and I think that especially him, he really concerns himself with that moment where like the words and pictures meet, and they're kind of part of the same thing. It's not just sort of like, let me write my script and then let me draw my nice pictures.
Yeah.
And they'll somehow match up. It's more like he really, you know, you could really tell in Daredevil that he was not fully scripting that out. He was really kind of creating that on the page, or creating that as an image before he finalized the words, you know.
Do you feel there are times when you are visualizing the cool moment when you're doing a book and you're writing and drawing? Or do you find it's how do you tend to start? Is it a mix? Do you tend to kind of have ideas or conversations? Do you kind of visualize how it's going to look before you know what people are going to say or the direction that the story's going to go? Generally
speaking, I think of it as visually. I like to think of things visually first. But I'll have little notepads where it's like, especially in Kaijumax, where I was kind of coming up with like dumb slang and stuff like that. You know, that was like all those things, you know, and phrases like, oh, here's a phrase that I heard somebody who's like on a post-prison podcast or whatever. They said this phrase. So I'll write that down, and maybe I can work it out with a pun on whatever, Rodan or something. And so I'll have these little bits and pieces of dialogue sort of like sprinkled around, but it's like I feel like it's so much more important to me to sort of work out a visual sort of like guide to a scene, even just to sort of say like, oh, here's where he changes his mind, and then the rest of the scene plays out that way. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'll write in a little bit of like scratch dialogue to sort of show what I'm talking about. But yeah, all that sort of stuff I feel like is really secondary from a speed point of view primarily, because if I had to write a full script for Kaijumax, we'd be here forever. We'd never get this comic done. But if I can go like, all right, open on this scene and this close in, and over the whole shoulder shot and over the shoulder shot, and then this, and here's another action scene. Then you can kind of be like 3/4 of the way there, and then it's like, they're gonna just say whatever they're gonna say.
So you kind of Marvel style yourself, basically.
I do, yeah, and I really like Marvel style stuff. I did some layouts for ironically a DC comic where Dan DiDio had done the plot, and then J.M. DeMatteis was going to do the script, and so I was doing layouts in between them, and it was fun because it's like then you don't have to like fit in like flowery words and stuff like that. It's just like, oh, these people are having a conversation. Okay, well then let's have a tall panel where they're kind of walking down the street and the word balloons can kind of be, and then, and I'm just saying like philosophy, like that's just writing that in there. There you go, Jim. You'll figure that out. And then, and so then, and then it's fun. And then you can really sort of feel like, oh, the broad strokes are there. And I can really sort of feel like, oh, okay, it's most important here that this person say is sort of like physically intimidating this person. Mm. And then you can kind of focus on that instead of like fitting in the word balloons that have, 14 words in there and 18 words in that one. And you know what I mean?
Yeah. Wow. So, that's really cool though. That's because it's one of those things that intrigues me when you're doing everything. I suppose everyone's different, right? But
sure. Yeah. But most people I know that do, well, I guess not most, but a lot of people I know that do both writing and art will kind of create on the page, just because, and I really do. A lot of times it's just like it's speed.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Why write a note to myself, big panel, or giant splash page with all this detail? It's like just
must save a lot of time doing it. I'll just do it all. It's fine.
Right. Well, and I mean, I always thought like the way that the comic book world works, I would always kind of like gaslit myself into thinking that like, oh, I couldn't do everything, and I probably can't do it on a monthly basis. But if you give yourself 6 weeks, all of a sudden, a lot of stuff becomes very possible. And sometimes it's like slotting somebody else in on another task, like lettering, in a way just slows it down. I mean, I don't have to do it, but then then I'm like, oh, I got to draw those buildings in the background that maybe are going to be covered by the word balloon and maybe not. And it's like, well, forget that. I'm going to do the word balloons. We're definitely not seeing those buildings.
Plus, I guess it gives you a chance to change the script as well if you really wanted to. I've got another joke.
And I totally do that. I totally do that. I'd be like, we can tighten this baby up a little bit.
That's one of the things I think I like most about comics is that when people talk about films nowadays, I find that the theme tends to be, have you seen Annihilation on Netflix yet? Like, no.
Yeah.
I haven't. Is it worth a watch? It's all right. Great. Whereas when I'm talking about comics, I'm going, this is amazing, because like there are so few hands in comparison to a TV series or a film. And then I think, more so probably with independent books or non-Big Two books. I mean, not always, but I think it tends to produce something that feels like it was what it was intended to be.
Yeah, I feel like, sometimes you're reading a comic and you're like, clearly this person is going through it, like in a way that you wouldn't see on Guardians of the Galaxy, when everything's going to be pretty much dictated ahead of time by the editors or whatever. But like, when an independent comic and you're like, this person's going through a tough decade, like, and they're putting it all on the page, and that's, it comes with good and bad, and sometimes but like it's like, oh, that feels like art to me. Not that there aren't a million types of art, but like that feels like art to me, where you're like, I I know what you're feeling, you know, and I know that this is a little bit rough around the edges, and that's good. Instead of something that's so polished.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's time and place for polished stuff too. I love to read a Swiss watch of a mystery, you know, like that's just perfectly put together. But
it's good to have a mix. I mean,
yeah.
All right. I want to jump on to your next one. And I'm really intrigued because, like, with all that thinking in mind, I'm curious to see what you pick, because you've thrown me with your first, you've thrown me with your at least your third. Actually, no, you throw me every single one tonight. So I'm genuinely intrigued. What have you got for your Holy Grail?
Okay, so it wasn't even really that hard to find, but I had been David Mazzucchelli. Is my favorite cartoonist, basically. Mm-hmm. I mean, or top 5 anyway. So like, and so I had this Daredevil Born Again collection, which Miller and Mazzucchelli, and it was, you know, it was fantastic. And I lent it to somebody years ago, 20 years ago plus, or I don't know, I lost it or something like that. I can't believe it, and you know, and it's like I've been looking for all the issues and all this sort of stuff. But then the artist edition came out, which is all the originals. And I'm like, that's $150. I don't have $150 to spend on it. Right? Crazy. But then it came out in softcover.
Oh,
and
did it? I didn't know that.
I just got it on Amazon. It wasn't really that hard to find, but it's amazing.
But the build-up was there. The build-up was there, Zander. The build-up was there, and I like it.
And it's like when it came, I was just like, oh, like it's just so, I love it so much. Like, and I must have read it 5 times, and then like. I found a copy of it online, you know, so I could look at it in color again, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, they did this cool thing with the color, and you know, yeah, it's just, I mean, it's astonishing. And reading it now, I mean, I read it a lot when I was like in middle school or whatever, mm-hmm. and reading it now as a cartoonist and as a storyteller, it's like, wow, they were so dialed in, for like, you know, like so much was happening in that last issue. They're cutting back and forth to all these like locales. They're just 2 panels in Mexico or whatever, and it's like, it's just wild that all this information could get across without it ever feeling crowded, without it ever feeling, you know, overstuffed.
It's so minimalist. Without, it doesn't feel like you're losing anything at all. Yeah. It's so well put together. Is it Mazzucchelli? It's pronounced.
Yeah.
His surname. I can never.
Mazzucchelli.
I'm terrible at pronouncing surnames. So sorry.
Well, and also like Miller creates this character who I guess is called Felix Manning, and he's just like a functionary of like the Kingpin. Doesn't have like a particular look, doesn't have a particular anything about him other than everything he says is sort of a malapropism. Like he always is this character was in a state of extreme aggregation, or you know. He fights like a man repossessed. I mean, and so like,
I don't remember that bit.
And it's just like creates this character. He hangs around. He does a few things. He threatens some people, and then he gets killed. And then you're like, that's amazing. He created this sort of like all-timer of like a background character just to kill him off.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
that's
not even real. I mean, kind of hoisted by his own petard, but not even really. And it's just like, they were dialed in. They were so dialed in making this comic. It's just incredible. So anyway.
How does it look?
And
sorry.
Oh,
I just want to see how
it's great.
looks
and
inside.
It's gorgeous.
Oh,
I mean, it's gorgeous, but then also like there's pages where there's So here's a cover, and then they had this like vellum pages in it too to show like the sort of the mechanical, you know.
How they did the process? Yeah,
like how he would do like a vellum sort of like separation. Yeah, and then I mean then there's whole sections too where you can see that that he used this special kind of paper where he was painting sort of things in sort of a grayscale.
Ah, yes.
And you can see that it's sort of like it's cut out and pasted up, and anyway, it's just I mean it's just neat, and it's nice to be able to read the whole thing again. And anyway, it's just yeah.
That's
you know,
beautiful.
I again, it's like I was telling you earlier that I'm not a collector so much as an accumulator, and it's like, yeah, I don't really seek out, like I friends of mine, actually I ran into a couple friends of mine at like a local comic convention recently, and I was saying like, oh well, did you find anything? And they're like, yeah, I mean, I found this, X-Men number whatever, and it was such a deal. It's 7.6 graded, and it's only costs $180. And I'm like, oh, like, and I'm like, I got this stack of comics for $19. They're in horrible condition, but like, there's a bunch of like, Jose Luis Garcia Lopez Atari Forces, and there's some Batman and the Outsiders by Alan Davis, and some Thors by Walt Simonson. I'm in heaven, like. And where will they go when I get home? I don't know, on the floor maybe. Like,
do you actually have a lot of time to read between everything you do? I mean, does it sometimes also on top of that? Does it sometimes feel just more like work in a way because you're kind of looking at other people's output and seeing if it maybe influences what you do? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I have time. I should spend more of it reading. Sometimes I'm just like flipping through my phone like an idiot. And
easily done.
I mean, yeah, I do sometimes, and it's like I'll have a stack of comics, and even just sort of looking through it and going like, man, that like, wow, they had 5 colors that they could use on this page, and look what they did. It's amazing. So sometimes it's academic, yeah. Sometimes it's nostalgic, like, oh, this is an old Gru comic that I remember really liking, and then sometimes, and a lot of times I'll read them digital. Like I do a lot of reading stuff digitally, and it's like, that's kind of fun. I mean, I have the Marvel app, and I'll read Spider-Man, 15 issues at a time, and be like, this is fun. Like, is it the best comic I ever read?
What era?
But like, it's like modern.
Oh, you do? You go for modern?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, so I wrote a Spider-Verse story.
I thought you did. Yeah. Was that Edge of Spider-Verse?
Edge of Spider-Verse.
Yeah.
And so I was talking to the editors there and stuff like that. And I was reading some modern stuff, and, because they're like, well, do you know what's going on? Like, what's going on with Spider-Man? Like, I think I know. And I did not know. I mean, like Batman and most stuff at DC, it's like, yeah, they kind of reset him every couple of years. Spider-Man, it's like, not, is Flash Thompson? Yeah. He went to high school with Peter Parker. He also served in Vietnam. He also was a Venom or whatever. And he also was this, and he also did that. And you're like, oh, you never just sort of like snip any of that stuff out. No, just keep going. Okay, sure.
That's a fair point. No, they tend to progress the side characters more, I think, in Spider-Man, don't they?
Yeah, or they just don't. Yeah, they just don't ever sort of reset them.
He tends to be always bad luck Parker. I'm going to go and share a flat with some guy. Pete, aren't you like 58 now? Like, yeah, I'm just going to go and share a flat and I only own some cheese. Like, come on, mate, you've got to pull yourself out of it.
Right.
And everyone else is going, I've been married 5 times and my husband is a hobgoblin.
I mean, he would have to have been born in like 1945. Like, he's as old as my dad,
But doesn't he look good for his age?
He looks fantastic. For being like in his 70s, Peter Parker looks fantastic.
We need to know what his skin
except for all the bruises and lacerations on his face that he always seems to have.
He's fine.
Yeah, John Romita Jr. just draws the most grotesque Peter Parkers. He just looks like he's been through the mill.
Oh, John Romita, yes,
every issue.
He does. You do kind of wonder. I remember seeing that. Funny enough, it was Alex Ross again who drew. I think it was one of the first times I'd seen this. It's when Batman showed it. It was his back on the front cover of an issue. It might have been a No Man's Land one years ago, and it was all the scars and stuff on his back. And you're going like, oh yeah, I guess he would like be covered in scratches and cuts and everything. But then they show them and they're like, perfect. I'm perfect.
Right.
And then Peter Parker's actually, John Romita Jr. draws him with like a gash in his nose and his face looks like it's hanging off. And then a couple of days later, he's like, hi everyone.
Right.
You look good for a 70-year-old man. Well done, you.
Yeah. It's anyway. Yeah, I think, and I mean, this is sort of a sidebar, but like anytime people are like, he'd really be in bad shape after fighting crime for all that time, and I'm like, I'm out of here. Like, I check out as soon as the conversation is like that. I'm like, yeah. I mean, it's like saying, oh, he should do something better with his time than fight crime. It's like, yes,
but that's the story.
So you are now no longer a 13-year-old. So move on to other media or take this for what it is, and unless you want to start reading the adventures of Bruce Wayne's, charity auction that he's doing. I don't know.
Poor guy, having someone wipe his butt. Page.
Yeah,
4 pages. Someone wiping his
Bruce
butt.
Wayne, is having somebody wipe his butt and run his charity auction to benefit the youth of Gotham,
and telling stories that he can't quite finish.
Right.
Good comics.
Okay. Thrill a minute.
That's why they start over again so frequently. So we're gonna look at your final choice for tonight, which is your favorite comic related merch.
I forgot to bring it, but I have one. I of course my favorite merch is the Electrogore stuffed animal that we have. That's my favorite. But okay. So anyway, the other one is I was in Paris a couple of years ago, and I got these like a little Obelix. A little asterisk. He's holding Dogmatix, But anyway, yeah. And I went to buy them from somebody at this little convention, and they're like, "You really want these?" And I'm like, "Yes." Like, we don't have that kind of stuff. Like, of course I want a little asterisk guy. I think asterisk is so old and boring to everybody. Everybody reads comics in France. Like, the latest, or I don't know about the latest, but a current one was coming out that week.
Right.
And this is in 2019.
Uh-huh.
And I think it sold 10 million copies. But I mean, I just think what comic in America has sold 5-10 million copies other than like Dogman or like a Raina Telgemeier thing or, But I mean, the week it came out, that was wild. And I got a copy in the departure lounge of the airport.
Oh, really?
It's like minutes before I was going to get on the airplane. I was like, I should probably get one of these,
I can ask a dumb question. Was it in French? And can you read
it? It was in French, and I can read very little of it,
But it's having a thing.
Yeah, it's having. I mean, it's $10. It's like, this is kind of cool. I got this thing, and that was the story too, where it's just like, oh, it was everywhere. I mean, and that was the thing. I was like, I'll have a chance to get it later, and I did.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think there was some figures announced recently for like Thundercats #1. They're doing a Thundercats series through Dynamite, and I can't. But the figures were something like 150,000. It was like, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, amazing.
God, I remember when X-Men #1
we'd all kill for that.
Sold 1 million, right?
Yeah.
But I suppose it's a shame, despite everything that's happened with all the films and everything that's tied into comics, that it hasn't kind of brought it back into comics. Aren't really in the mainstream. It's just the film versions that are in the mainstream.
Yeah, and I mean, I also think comics make more money than they've ever have as an industry, but it's split. I mean, they used to, when I was in the 90s, I remember people saying like, there's more people who play professional basketball than who draw comics professionally. And I remember thinking, oh, that's kind of funny, and I don't think that's even remotely the case anymore. Like, so many people make comics in so many different forms that all that money, even if there's more, it has to be split so many more ways. And, and like a new X-Men isn't a cultural event like it was.
No, that's true.
90, whatever.
That's
and also
true.
Like that was being goosed by like people buying multiple copies because they were putting it into, slabbing it or whatever.
This will be worth a fortune when everyone else owns this in the future and is trying to sell it at exactly the same time.
Right. As we snicker into our sleeves, haha, I didn't even get one. Actually, I probably did.
I did.
Yeah. I mean, Jim Lee, he's great. He was the one artist of that sort of like huge breakout group that I really thought, this guy really is great at what he does.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although
it's quite funny, I found like after everyone moved on, and I started looking at other stuff, the creators I tended to be drawn to they drew a slightly more toned down style. So finding people like Mike Mignola around that time, that was what I tended to be drawn to. And it was kind of funny because as a kid, I was looking at these creators who were like putting loads and loads of little lines on you going, whoa, that's amazing. Wow. And then you
more
go,
lines equals more
Mignola's cool. There are like 3 colors on this page.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I was sold on Mike Mignola from the very start. Like anything that he drew, I would get it, even if he just did the cover.
Yeah.
I remember Cosmic Odyssey was that DC. It was kind of like this big DC team up, and Jim Starlin wrote it, so it's super cosmic, and and I remember feeling like this was like there's a certain era of growing up, and there's a certain era of like media where you're like, this is real. I am so invested in this. I'm on the edge of my seat. I cannot wait to find out what happens next. Like, oh my gosh, Jon Stewart condemned an entire planet of people to die because of his foolishness or whatever. And, I was like, my God, no, Jon Stewart, please. I mean, and the art was just, the art was amazing, and it was painted by Steve Oliff. I mean, it's just.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
I don't think Steve Oliff gets half the credit that he should for like completely reinvigorating comics.
Yeah. Did you get the Thor omnibus version of the Simonson run?
No.
He recolored the whole thing.
Oh wow.
And Simonson wanted him to recolor it because there's so much negativity towards the coloring in certain types of print and in digital. Yeah. And any kind of recoloring, people get quite upset. But he wanted him to do it, and it's incredible. Like, I kind of thought that Simonson would work better in flat color, but it's something to look at. It brings it to a whole nother level. I literally lie on my floor and read that book like I'm 9 again, and flip through those pages, and my face hurts from grinning at it. It's just beautiful.
Well, and Simonson's such a light touch with lines that you'd have to really paint the whole thing. Just almost using the lines as just a guide. Yeah,
well, that's just it.
I got to check that out.
Small book. Really cool. I think they're re-releasing it soon as well. So if you do like that run, it's a really nice way to get it because it's everything and it looks pretty. So, it's well worth a look.
Yeah. Well, that would be great. I mean, again, like that Simonson writing and art on Thor, like that was this incredible, this is like the vision of one person that's super idiosyncratic and super, can kind of go down these sort of side alleys, and and it wasn't at the era where it had to kind of say like, oh yeah, Thor, made a detour into Spider-Man's comic this month, and then he made a detour into this, he could just be retelling all kinds of Norse sagas.
Yeah, the tone when people were saying when Ragnarok the film came out, they were going, Thor's not a comedy. That era is funny. It's funny. It genuinely makes me laugh every time I read it. So, and I'm hard to please. Note that I'm hard to please. Right. But yeah, it really hits nicely. It's like the most joyful thing you can read as an old school comics fan. It's dipping back into those issues. It's just so much fun.
Oh yeah. I love seeing that stuff. And I mean, I'm halfway there on recoloring. It's like sometimes I'm like, sometimes I don't even want them to like reprint it. I want them to shoot it from the page, like the printed page. Because sometimes it's like, well, you put those color separations onto a perfectly white page, and it's
it doesn't work.
Way too much.
It doesn't work.
Yeah, no, it's like, oh, I need that yellow underneath to sort of like kind of cheat everything towards a warmer tone.
That was funny enough. That was why I struggled with Born Again when they reprinted it the first time on pure white paper, and it was like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Where's the mood?
Yeah. I mean, like, whereas like the gold standard for recoloring is Batman Year One, where Richmond Lewis, who had originally colored it and did a great job in the color separation era, then painted it, and it's like, wow, it's just amazing. I mean, then it's this true companion piece to Dark Knight Returns. So
yeah, and it doesn't upset anyone if you get the original colorless back.
Right. Somebody would be upset. I'm sure people were upset.
Bound to be upset.
They just weren't so loud.
Yeah, which is fine. They can stay that way. Yeah. I mean, speaking of things that are joyful and colourful to look at, if you haven't read Kaijumax, do yourself a favour. Pick this book up. It is fantastic. There are 6 trade paperback versions, or else there are 6 minis to pick up if you prefer single issues, or do what I did and grab these just incredible deluxe editions. My arms hurt. My arms hurt right now. And it's all your fault, but thank you for.
I know, yeah.
What have you got lined up next? Is there anything you can talk about?
Well, I just I'm working on a horror series that just got, it just got approved by Image, so we'll we'll get that going, and it's basically the opposite of Kaijumax. It's just a couple characters and not as,
Wow.
almost no color, and it's,
Wow.
yeah, it's very, very down to earth. But also, I'm drawing it, so it looks like a bunch of silly little cartoon characters killing each other or whatever. So.
Well, I'm already looking forward to it.
Right.
Genuinely.
Yeah.
So, Zander, thank you so much for coming on to the Omniverse Comics Guide and talking about some of the favorite pieces in your collection. And for talking about Kaijumax, my all-time favorite series. Just want to reiterate that. Hard to please. All-time favorite series.
I can't believe it, frankly. I mean, I'll take it, but it's hard for me to believe.
Oh, man.
When people are like, "Oh, it's my favorite series," it's like, cut the crap already.
Have you not read Born Again?
Yeah, right, yeah. So all these other comics. But anyway, yeah. I really appreciate it. As much as I joke, I think it's such a nice feeling to sort of feel like it connected with people in a way that isn't academic. It isn't just like people like, oh, the art's nice, like very well, nicely constructed. It's like, I love it, or I love this character, or I hate this character. Then that's just like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to do, was make you feel something.
Yeah.
Even if it was something awful.
Well, they're the best comics. The ones that you come away from either crying, laughing, hurting,
right,
angry,
going,
whatever. At least you feel something. And this is an emotional roller coaster, so I strongly recommend it. Zander, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh,
and
thanks for having
hopefully
me.
we'll catch up another time.
Yeah, absolutely.